Alright, hello again. Today's webinar we're going to be talking about section 2 of the philosophy section, getting into a little bit more of the application specific material of the philosophy side in this module. So without further ado, just kind of a quick review of what was covered in section 1. We talked a little bit about customer first thinking, understanding how people play is the most valuable resource within an organization, the role of Kaizen in connecting human development to achieving the goals of customer first thinking, really the reasoning behind why we want to focus where value-added activities are taking place for improvement efforts, and then kind of the theme of what tools we can use and really the value in making sure that all levels of management, everything is aligned top to bottom, bottom to top in that effort to move forward together. So in this section we're going to be putting that in action and talking a little bit about what that looks like when we do that. So kind of the outline for this section. This is the material we're going to be covering. So for the first point, business need driving daily objectives. That ties into a little bit about moving forward together. But for kind of the lean concepts definition of ultimate business need, we kind of define it as these three kind of key ideals. And that is, we want to build product and processes that are the highest quality, produce with the shortest lead time, and again, produce with the lowest cost. So we also want to make sure that we're constantly working on human development. Kind of those first two ideas right there, business need, human development, talked a little bit about, kind of self-explanatory. What we are going to dig a little bit deeper into is how we can use this concept of Kaizen to increase value-added work and eliminate MUDA, which is waste. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the difference between true efficiency and maybe a traditional understanding of efficiency. And then the last thing we're going to hit on is this idea of competence versus efficiency. So when we talk a little bit about how we actually increase value-added work. So say we have a given process, and you'll see up there that it takes a certain amount of time, up to takt time. Don't worry about what takt time is right now. We'll cover that a little bit later on. Just for right now, just assume that it's just the amount of time that it takes to accomplish a certain task or complete a certain process. So within our example here, we've gotten a certain amount of time that's value-added work. That's time that we're actually, adding value to whatever it is we're producing. We've gotten a certain amount of time that's allocated to incidental work. It could be tool change, it could be a bathroom break, anything that happens on a repeatable basis that isn't directly contributing to what we're producing, but is kind of a required function that goes along with the day-to-day operation of the organization. So not ideal, but something that we live with. And then the last thing in red up at the top is MUDA, or waste. And every process, everywhere, everything has some level of waste in it. Right? Some more than others, some have very little, some have a lot, but there's always waste somewhere. And that's a key thought. And so when we talk about how do we increase the amount of value-added work we can accomplish within that same amount of time, what we want to work to do is we want to try and minimize that incidental work time as much as we can. But the main thing we want to focus on is driving down the amount of waste, driving down the amount of time we spend dealing with problems, having waste, having to get things repaired, missing things we need, running around in circles, that type of stuff. And so when we do that, then that time that we save that we were wasting, we can now replace that time with more value-added work. So within that same overall takt time or process time, we're now accomplishing more, right? That's kind of the key thinking behind what is efficiency. So when we talk about MUDA or waste, what is it? So kind of the broad definition for it, because everyone kind of has their own, but really the broad definition of waste in terms of the lean world is any unnecessary steps or elements or things that you have to do that isn't directly contributing to building or creating the output that you're looking for. So there's there's 7 key types of waste: overproduction, waiting, conveyance, overprocessing, inventory, motion, and correction. Those are the 7 big ones. Overproduction, of course, is making more than the customer needs. Waiting is when you've got idle time. Conveyance is having to move something from A to B and back to A and over to C and over to D. Think a grocery store where when you go shopping, you've got to go to 100 different aisles to find everything you want, right? That's conveyance. That's a waste of your time. Overprocessing is doing more work than needs to be done to accomplish your goals. So a great example of that is, say you need to accomplish steps 1 through 5, but then someone thinks that maybe it's necessary to do steps 6 through 8, just because they feel it's necessary, or we don't have a clear definition of what actually is required, right? That extra work above and beyond what's actually required, that's a form of waste. Inventory is also a form of waste, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, because that one's not quite as clean cut as the others, and that's definitely one when you bring up that most people tend to raise a red flag and go, now wait a minute. So we'll talk about that a little bit more. Motion, and that idea kind of talks to, it's kind of similar to overprocessing, but it's human motion. So if my work process is designed, imagine I'm working in an office at a desk, and I have to fill out, say I have to fill out a form and put a couple labels on it. If I have to fill it out here, but I have a label up here and over here and then back down here and then under in a drawer, that's a lot of moving around I've got to do to accomplish my task. That's the waste of motion that we're talking about, minimizing how much movement is required. And then the last one is correction, and that's pretty self-explanatory. Anytime we're reworking or fixing something, that's waste. That's time that could be spent actually building something we'll get paid for instead of fixing something that we made a mistake on in the first place. So, again, kind of going back to it, and this is something that people bring up, overproduction, making more than we need, is that really waste? And is inventory really waste? Because if you make more than you need, you can always put it in a warehouse, you'll sell it eventually, right? So let's take a look at that. So for the first one on inventory, let's talk a little bit about how we actually accumulate inventory. Where does it come from? And so there's really 3 things that kind of determine how much inventory we have when we think about it. One is the rate of withdrawal. How often are we pulling that inventory? Is it raw material on a shelf that we're pulling to turn into something else? Are we working in a warehouse and it's how frequently our customers ordering it that we're pulling it down and shipping it? So that's the rate of withdrawal. How quickly are we using it? Then the second thing that goes into it is what's the rate with which we're putting it back on the shelf after we take it. So again, in the warehouse scenario, how quickly can purchasing get more of it in after we've shipped it? Or if it's in a manufacturing plant, how quickly can the assembly line upstream make more parts to replace the ones we just pulled to use somewhere else? And then the last component really is the lead time for resupply, and that kind of ties back into this rate of production and replenishment, right? So how frequently or how long does it take for our suppliers to get replacement product to us? So with that thinking, and this is why I said this one's not quite so cut and dry, inventory technically is waste, because it is product and items and value that we have put money into that we're not actually using at present. So in a true lean environment with real lean thinking, we always want to be adding value. We don't want to have any stagnant material or any stagnant inventory, because that's sunk money that's just sitting on a shelf that we can't be using for other things. It's things that we're not getting paid for right at this moment. And in a lean environment, it's all about what are we doing right at this moment. So, technically, all inventory is waste, but we always do need some in the real world, right? Because we don't live in the ideal lean world, and problems come up. We have to deal with some issues. We don't always have perfect control over our lead times, and we most certainly don't always have perfectly structured withdrawal and replenishment mechanisms. So the goal then is how can we keep that inventory at a bare minimum? And one of the ways we can focus on it is what can we do to keep reducing our inventory? And that is a more straightforward concept that's a little bit easier to understand. We always want to try and bring our inventory levels down. So, outside of inventory, when we think back to overprocessing, some of the other forms of waste, which one would you think is most critical? out of these 7: overprocessing, waiting, conveyance, overproduction, inventory, motion, and correction. And I'll let everybody kind of think about that for a while, because it's not necessarily a simple question, and you can make a good case for almost all of these. But what I will do, just to move along, is I'll give you guys a little bit of a hint. And really, overproduction, in terms of real-world impact to the organization, to the bottom line, dollars and cents, it's overproduction. And when we look at overproduction, we want to talk about how can we prevent it. Because what overproduction does is now you have product that we've made, we've put all the money, all the resources, all the effort into making a product start to finish, but we can't sell it and we can't get paid for it. So those are resources that could have been put towards something we would have gotten paid for immediately that we've now put into something that has to sit on a shelf that we can hopefully sell in the future, right? So that's why overproduction is critical to try and minimize, because that's a lot of money that we tie up to sit over in another building. So then we think about, all right, well, how can we prevent it or minimize it? And the key idea here is to equalize the pace of production. So if you take these 4 sample processes, if A produces at the same rate as B, at the same rate as C, at the same rate as D, you never have an opportunity for overproduction and material to build up in between each one of these processes. Because as soon as one is finished, the next one is taking it and building it and shipping it down the line. So that's kind of the thinking that we want to do. We can contain this overproduction when all areas, all processes produce at the same rate. But the goal of this being, we want to try and contain that variation. We don't want one of our areas to be able to make things twice as fast as the next area, because we're just going to be piling parts up, piling product, piling inventory up all over our shop. And I can guarantee that almost everybody out there has walked into a warehouse or walked into a factory or an office and seen stacks and boxes of in-process inventory because one area can make it faster than the next area can use it. So, kind of the big picture thinking then out of that, and in kind of ideal core base lean thinking terms, our overall goal should be to match our pace of production to our pace of sales. So when we sell X number of widgets or processes or forms processing, whatever it is, we want to be able to make that exact same amount, produce at the rate that we're selling. Because if they're equal, same thing as before, we're never going to accrue inventory or run out. We'll always have just the right amount, and that's the goal that we're shooting for. So, moving beyond that, to talk a little bit about kind of what really true efficiency is. There's kind of a couple things we'll talk about, the difference between process efficiency versus overall system efficiency, this concept of operational availability and how it can be used as a tool to judge and measure our level of effectiveness and efficiency. And then the last thing we'll kind of hit on is the difference between just forcing work and actually making an efficiency improvement. So on the first one, we'll take a sample process just to run through kind of the description of it. But our customer demand, they say they want 90 units, so we produced 90 units. It took 5 workers, 10 hours, 10-hour shifts, so you got 50 total hours of work time, which means we were able to produce 1 unit per every 1.8 hours. So, again, down at the bottom, that's our benchmark, right? That's our rate of production, 1 unit every 1.8 hours. So, what we want to look at is if we were to come into this as good lean thinkers to say, how can we make this more efficient? How can we make this better? What would we do? Well, the first thing we might do is we might say, okay, well, we looked at this, now we produced 125 units. We still only used 5 people, so we didn't add any more people, so we didn't add any more man hours. So we look at our total, our rate of production now, and we went from 1.8 to 2.5 units per man hour, which seems great on the surface. We really improved our rate of production. But the catch there is, what about that gap for overproduction that we introduced? So even though we got more efficient, now we have a bunch of parts that we paid to make that are sitting in a box over in the corner that we can't sell. So while it looks on the surface like we made an improvement, the question we have to ask ourselves is, how much of an improvement did we really make? And again, that's kind of what we talked about before. So if we're only getting more efficient because we're overproducing, that just makes that one process look better on paper, right? That rate of production for that one process went up, which looks good. But now it's going to be someone else within the organization that now has to deal with the side effects of what we did. That's not true system efficiency. That's not what we're really after. So another example of how we can improve the efficiency, let's take a look. Say we implemented another set of changes. The result of that was that we ended up producing 90 units, which is exactly what the customer wanted, but it only took us four team members to do it. So we cut our man hours to make it down to 40. So now the rate of production is down, or up, is up to 2.25 units per hour. So 1.8 to 2.25. That's still an improvement. Not as much as 2.5 as we had before, but still better than our baseline. The difference being we eliminated that waste of overproduction. So true system efficiency is maintaining our customer demand. We don't want to just cheat and make a trillion of the things. We want to meet our customer demand while we improve our OA, while we reduce the amount of time that we're taking, so we can improve that rate of production without making more than we actually need. And so then again, improving OA. And so then the difference really between process and system efficiency, and this is just to kind of summarize, put it all in a quick little graphic, but process efficiency, where you've got one particular process that's producing much, much faster than the rest of the system, you kind of end up with that rowboat example, where you end up just kind of rowing in circles. That's a good way to think of process efficiency, and why it's not a great idea to just focus on making one little area the best possible without considering how it impacts everything else. On the other hand, true system efficiency is where we level up the entire value stream, start to finish, together, so that we can keep everything nice, level, and balanced. That's kind of what we're shooting for. So again, system efficiency, true system efficiency, is maintaining that customer demand, no overproduction, just meeting that demand exactly while improving our rate of production, while improving our OA. So what is OA? OA stands for operational availability, and in this particular case we have just a sample work balance chart for a production line. So you've got a couple different processes on here, Reef 1, Reef 2, ELE, you've got some cabinet, FA1, 2, then test at the end of it. And what this chart shows, don't get hung up on the details of the chart, but the blue bars show that for each little step how much is actual value added time, and the yellow bars is how much is wait time. So as you can see, the production isn't very balanced here. So the definition of OA in terms of a process like what we're looking at is that ratio of value added work time to the total allotted process time. Think back to that first chart we looked at. If we've got 5 hours to do something, but we're only using 2.5 of it to actually add value, that's an OA of 50%. That's not real great. We can do better than that. Similarly, on the flip side, if we had 5 hours to do something and all 5 hours were spent adding value to that product, that's 100% OA, and that is ideal. That's great. That's a model. And our goal should always be to try and get to 100%. So, in this particular case, in that FA1 example, you're only adding value for 1.7 hours out of the total 6.3. That's a 27% OA. As managers, as lean coordinators, Kaizen leaders, when we look at that, that jumps out as something that we can do something about. Now on the flip side, so this Reef 1, now you're taking 8.5 hours. You've got 8.5 hours worth of work that he's got to do in 6.3 hours. That's 135% OA. Now while 135% may sound great, because more is always better, in this case, if you go over 100, that means now we're asking our team members to do more work than can physically be done in the time to do it. And the question we should be asking ourselves at that point is, how sustainable is that really? And just as a little hint, it's not. In practice, that's something that's very, very difficult to maintain when you've got processes that are structured where they have to be able to do more work in the allotted time consistently. That's a struggle. So there's a couple different things just in this particular example of things that we could do to try and improve the overall OA and system efficiency of what we were looking at. So Here, just again for the sake of example, this is that same system, but we've made some different changes to it. So now you notice how there's fewer actual steps in there, and for the steps that are left, each one of them now has a little bit more value-added work time in it. And so, looking at FA, essentially what we did in this example is we said, well, why do we have 3 little workstations here with very tiny OA? Let's combine them all together and make one workstation with a much higher OA, which is what we did here. So now we have a little over 5 hours worth of real good value-added work in that total allotted time. So at 81% OA, did we make an improvement there? And the answer would be yeah. We have fewer processes, fewer people, fewer steps, and each one of those steps now is spending a greater percent of its time doing good value-added work. That's how OA is a tool that can help us understand how effective we're being with each one of our steps. So there's OA of just processes. You can really take a fine little narrow view of kind of the inner workings of what's happening. And then there's also OA of an organization, which is something where we can step a little bit further back and say, overall big picture, how effective are we being at meeting our customers' demand? And so to do that, this is again another little example. So say we're producing something, widget, procedure, paperwork, could be anything, whatever. And the production capability goes from 0 to some number, we'll just call it X, right? So our capacity, if we were cranking full bore, everybody fired up, everybody running a full shift, we could produce 100%. We could produce that full amount. But say just due to the economy, market conditions, competitors, or whatever, any number of factors, say our customer demand is only half of what we could actually produce, right? So we're running at half capacity just based on what our customers are actually asking for. So kind of that rate of operation then is what are we actually producing at? If capacity is what could we do, our rate of operation is what are we actually doing now. Remember, think current condition, shop floor focus. What are we doing right now? So if our demand is half of our capacity, we would start out, if we were running our organization, and we'd say, okay, we need to produce half of full value of our product and we'll meet our customer demand. And you flip the switch and say, let's go turn it on and let's go make it. Well, what happens in the real world? Well, one, we have problems, which means we can't quite meet that 50% in our regular workday because we've got waste, we've got issues. So say now we've dropped down and we could only do 45%. Then maybe we have an equipment failure or a shutdown or a malfunction or a leak or a valve breaks or someone calls in sick. Well, that takes a little bit more off what we could do because we're handicapped, we're dealing with that. Then you've also got incidentals. So again, if you've got changeover, you've got a shift change, you've got a break for lunch, you've got breaks, you've got that incidental work, that whatever that could be, that also takes a little bit off. So then what happens is the result is we said, okay, we want to hit 50% of what we could do, but then in the real world, we were only able to hit 39%, right? We couldn't meet our target because of all these problems and issues we ran into. That's probably the best way to think about that. And that makes a lot of sense. Everyone runs into that every day. You start your day and say, I want to accomplish these amount of things, but things come up, issues happen, and you only got half of that done, right? Happens to individual people, happens to whole organizations too. The difference is, with that production loss, in terms of organizational OA, that's how we measure that production loss. So in that case, we're at an organizational OA of 78%. And that may seem like that number is a little crazy. Where did it come from? Well, we want to look at what our current demand was. So thinking again, planned versus actual. We planned for 50%. We only got 39%. So our OA, we got a little bit more than 3/4 of what we tried to get. That's what our OA says. And just like processes, our organizational OA, we want to drive it to get to 100%. Because if we're at 100% organizational OA, it means that we were actually able to meet what we set out to do. And that is a key goal, a key aspect of a true lean, effective organization. So now we can look at this chart in terms of problem solvers, because that again is one of the core tenets of lean. Okay, that's great that we can see we have an issue. What are we going to do to fix it? Who's responsible to fix it? How do we figure that out? So in this case, we've got a production loss, right? We planned to do 50, we only got 39. Who owns that? Well, production management owns the difference between what we planned and what we were able to produce. Then you look at, well, what was our maximum capacity versus what do we have orders for? What's our customer demand? In this example, our demand is only half of what we could produce. Well, who owns that? That's the sales management's responsibility. Someone needs to be out there drumming up more sales. If we can produce more, we need to find a way to sell more. And then at the very top, in big picture thinking, your top executive management is responsible for overseeing the sales gap and the production gap, right? In a lean organization, that's how we allocate those responsibilities in terms of being able to problem solve and correct when we have OA deficiencies like that. So, the two things to focus on out of this is we've got rate of operation, which was related to sales management and their goals, and then you've got operational availability, or OA, which is related to production management and their goals. That's kind of the two key things. So, those two key things translate into the two main kinds of structural waste within an organization. So one, the rate of operation, or RO, is our actual customer demand divided by what the maximum is we could produce. Remember that full bar versus the half bar in the example. So we call that potential. What could we potentially make versus what are we planning to make based on our customer demand, right? That's the waste of potential. Huge. That means we could be doing more, but we're not, and that's a waste that we need to address. The second one, operational availability, what was our actual production divided by our customer demand? This one is planned versus actual, right? So you can see how it kind of cascades. And that is the waste of our processes. So those are the two big ones. Sales management needs to correct our waste of potential. Production management needs to start addressing the waste of our processes, right? That's key. So, moving on, kind of the next thing we were going to talk a little bit about is forcing work versus raising efficiency. And when we get into that a little bit, what we really want to do is we want to make sure that we're actually eliminating waste first before we start trying to add in value-added work to it, because that's the sustainable way to do it. Because in this example, if we had said, all right, we want to try and improve our efficiency by getting more done in the same amount of time. Remember that tack time, that little process time. Well, if we don't eliminate the waste first, and we just try and add more work on top, now you're back into that situation we saw before in the example where you're asking someone to do 130% of the work in only the regular amount of time. And that's just not sustainable. And what ends up happening in the real world when we do this is forced work looks like an improvement, and everyone thinks, this is great, we've done it, but 3 weeks later, 2 days later, a month later, you start to lose all of that improvement because it's not sustainable. We haven't respected our people and put them in a position to be successful. And so that's really why Kaizen is the basis for how we improve efficiency, because Kaizen, along with being the mechanism by which we can develop our people, grow that human resource, and increase our ability to meet the goals of customer first thinking, Kaizen is also that continuous improvement mechanism that we use to eliminate waste, to problem solve and eliminate waste, which then allows us to raise our efficiency. And again, going back to that original shot, we want to eliminate the waste first and then add more value-added work on top of it. That's the sustainable way to go about improving OA. So then the last kind of key thing we're going to talk about is kind of this notion of competence and how it's different from efficiency. And so we can really see that our focus with what we want to do is we want to eliminate waste to improve OA so that we're more effective at carrying out the goals of our organization. And so really one of the things we want to be concerned about and we want to make sure we're aware of when we're going about that is, are we being competent versus purely pursuing efficiency? So what is competence? And competent performance, really in kind of the philosophical definition, is the relationship between the value of the accomplishment and the cost of the behavior. So we use this example because the value of accomplishments can really be kind of fluid. but probably the easiest way to understand it is think about it in terms of like a results or an improvement or a benefit, something measurable. You know, how good were the results? Were they great? Were they mediocre? Was the improvement substantial? Was there a great benefit to the organization by doing it, or was it maybe not so much? So that's really what we want to think about when we're trying to kind of understand what the value of a given accomplishment is. Similarly, the cost of behavior, all that really represents is kind of an understanding of the cost of how we went about achieving those results. You know, did we have to hire a whole team of consultants or start a third shift? Or was it something simple that we could do by having, you know, a focus group that made a suggestion and we were able to implement it relatively effortlessly? So kind of the key takeaway there is there's a scale of value of accomplishments, from not very helpful to really helpful. There's also a scale for cost of behavior, from small cost, easy to do, to huge cost requiring a lot of investment from the organization to do that, to implement that. So when we talked about efficiency before, efficiency really only affects the cost of behavior. And if I encourage everyone to think a little bit about that, because it's one of those things that at first glance maybe sounds a little counterintuitive. But if you think deeper about it, efficiency really only applies to the way we go about doing things. It doesn't really apply to how worthwhile was the goal that we were trying to do in the first place. And that's the key difference. Because if we have good efficiency but bad results, that's not competent performance on behalf of the organization, right? That's the key point here, is what we really want to do if we're making sure that we're a competent organization is that we're valuing the accomplishments, the results, more than the behavior. We want to make sure that we're focusing on good results versus putting all of our emphasis on good, efficient behavior. That's key. So, kind of one last little slide I like to throw in there at the end of this is I do this because more often than not, when you get into this, you find that there are maybe not the best accomplishments or bad accomplishments. Happens all the time. Even in the best organizations, we always fall short of our goals. So when we want to start troubleshooting that, finding out what's wrong, why didn't we meet our goal here, where is this problem coming from, in a lean organization with lean thinking, in this culture, we understand, almost by definition, but not that formal, that really poor accomplishments come from only three places. It's either behavior, which is related to the method, the way we're going about it, or the skills of the team member trying to accomplish that behavior. If it's not behavior, it could be the environment, which is, do we have the right tools? Do we have adequate resources to meet these goals, to meet these accomplishments? Or it could be a management issue. Do we have proper management support? Do we have proper management accountability? Remember, this goes back to section 1. One of the primary roles of management is supporting and motivating, growing that human resource, and then providing accountability to make sure that we're meeting our expectations. Now, in real life, it's never one of the three. It's generally a combination of all three, but those are the main areas that we want to focus on when we start looking for what's not going right. And so kind of the key summary out of this is that in a lean culture, when we get there, what we understand that when there's a problem, we work to try and understand that problem, to try and identify what the business need is to correct that problem, and then we want to be able to deploy the correct lean concept to fix that deficiency. That's at the core, and that's at the heart of good lean problem solving, which coincidentally and not coincidentally, like a lot of things in these webinars, is the next recommended section. So this is why we put problem solving at this point in the course material, is because it really becomes one of the first critical skills to being able to start implementing some of these main philosophical goals. Okay, lastly, I'd like to touch on kind of this key idea of respect for people. Just one more time, in the context of problem solving and kind of troubleshooting accomplishments. And really kind of the key focus here is that in order to kind of really maximize the human development in this area, what we really want to do is we want to stay focused on the ground up. And remember, that goes back to the concept from section 1 of improvements coming from the ground up versus from the top down. We also want to empower team members, to own their processes. Let them own their processes. They're the experts. Remember, the individuals that are working day in and out, where the actual value is being added. Remember, that's where we want to focus. They know better than anybody else what the real current condition is and how it's happening and what's going on and what the problems are. And we really want to be able to take advantage of that resource and that knowledge. We also want to make sure we're empowering team members to solve their own problems, and this is huge. And the reason that we want to do this is because an organization, any organization, gets the most benefit when it's an environment that's full of problem solvers versus having just one or two key people that do it. Just imagine the difference in kind of organizational capability if you have every single team member and individual within that facility, within that organization, that's capable and empowered to be an active problem solver. Just what ability that actually provides and what type of leg up that would give under any different scenario. And really the reason this is so critical, all of this, is because that feedback, the perspective, and really being able to get the expertise from engaging our team members in our workforce is absolutely critical to creating effective, sustainable improvement. The types of things that we can put in place today that are still going to be as effective and as useful and more importantly, being consistently used, tomorrow, a week from now, a month from now, a year from now, 10 years from now, right? This is how we make sure that any improvements we're making, any change in course, any change in strategy and process is actually beneficial to the team members that are adding value to the product, kind of on the front line where that value is being added, because when we incorporate them, we ensure that anything we do is something that they're going to be on board with, and that's really the key there. So kind of the summary from this, just a quick wrap up of kind of putting this philosophy into place. We want to make sure that every activity we're doing is working towards addressing and meeting our ultimate business need. We also want to make sure that we're developing our people, every minute of every day at every opportunity. We want to make sure that we're using Kaizen as the mechanism for eliminating waste so that we can start adding more value-added work, improving our OA. We also want to make sure that we're actually really raising efficiency and not just kind of getting by forcing work, because as we saw from the example, that's not very sustainable. That's not really what we want to do. And then the last thing is we want to make sure that any improvement initiative, any change initiative, any efficiency improvements we're working towards really are competent in that definition that we gave earlier, in that they lead to benefits that are worthy, that mean something. It's not an exercise just for an exercise sake. That's really the key there. So, as always, any questions can be directed to the website, and I'll see you guys for the next section in the next module.